It is a period of Cold War, waged between the United States and the Soviet Union. The fate of the solar system hangs in the balance as both sides race to explore and claim the final frontier of outer space. Should conflict erupt outside our planet, new weapon systems were imagined to fight in the vacuum and on inhospitable worlds, none more so than the moon. These videos are made possible by the generous support of our patrons. Thank you for all that you give. Now, without any further ado, let's get into lunar tanks and moon combat. This article was written by Andrew Hills and edited and voiced by ya boy Jim Zawacki. When, at the end of July 1955, the United States announced its intention to launch artificial satellites into orbit around the Earth, the Soviets responded by creating their own space program, culminating in the launch of Sputnik in October 1957, the world's first artificial satellite, and the start of what would later become known as the space race. Winning it would mean control over enemy surveillance satellites, the ability to spy on anyone, anywhere, and also to deploy weapons uncounterable by Earthling foes. Yet, to establish one's interstellar hegemony, you need to settle down somewhere first. Last year, 1958, Air Force General Homer A. Bushi stated that a lunar military base someday will be vital to national security. That in one sense, the moon represents the age-old military advantage of the high ground. He is one of many uniformed American leaders seriously thinking in terms of the military relation of outer space to the Earth and human events thereon. While there is perhaps no unified agreement in American military circles on the concept of that he who controls the moon controls the Earth, nevertheless, there is a well-grounded agreement that vital military keys to our future national defense lie in outer space. This was made official in 1958 when the U.S. Secretary of Defense Neil McElroy ordered the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, to take a close look at the moon. This was followed in October of that year by President Eisenhower declaring the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Good old NASA. The moon, however, was indeed a tough cookie for colonization, primarily due to its lack of a functional atmosphere, leading to no air and no ozone layer, also leading to unfiltered radiation and extreme temperature shifts. Add to this, the surface is covered in dusty regolith, which is sort of like sand, in that it is coarse, rough, irritating, and it gets everywhere. And at the time, it could not even be properly analyzed, since there were no spacecraft that were yet capable of going to the moon and bringing some back for study, prompting some to want to nuke the moon and collect the lunar shrapnel, rather than go out there and come get it. This material also covers the moon's many hard-to-negotiate craters and cliffs. Also, compasses don't work there either. Overall, this inhospitable place would be among the most unforgiving environments ever to house humans. Yet humanity is always up to the challenge. The preparation for such a monumental undertaking, now dubbed Project Horizon, was bestowed upon Lieutenant General Arthur Trudeau, Chief of Army Research and Development, who established a 6-phase plan where, starting in 1959, they would develop and produce all necessary technology, assess the costs, construct the base, and establish a permanent crew of around 300 personnel. And all of this was supposed to happen before the end of 1967. Understanding that he would need a lot of help for this, Lieutenant General Trudeau called upon the finest German rocket scientists, were repatriated under Operation Paperclip. The three most prominent among them were Dr. Werner von Braun, Heinz Hermann Köhler, and Dr. Georg Heinrich Patrick Baron von Teisenhausen, as well as numerous other scientists, military leaders, and policymakers. Once the plan for the base had been finished, there was much debate on what it should do. A 1959 report called for a lunar-based Earth bombardment system designed to deliver nukes to the Earth with an accuracy of 2 to 5 nautical miles. Yet there was still the conundrum on how to get all of these materials from Earth to the Moon. 229 flights was the projected amount needed to bring all the necessary people and stuff to the Moon base. This total included preparatory launches, which would bring said people and stuff into orbit around the Earth first. Next, after the 229 first flights, 149 more round trips were needed to supply the base for close to 2.5 years, amounting to little over 1 flight per week. Due in part to the incredible volume of spaceflight, any and all optimizations to the plan were encouraged, such as launching from somewhere near the Earth's equator, as well as new and improved rocket designs, such as ones which would be powered by nuclear detonation, were also hoped to help streamline the process. Until then, the robust and ready Saturn I and II rockets were the go-to. The living space for the 300 moon dwellers was to be at least somewhat underground, in order to protect them against radiation and meteors. Its construction would resemble that of an underground fallout shelter, composed of conjoined modules for residence and working. As construction went along, it was to be electrified by an increasingly powerful series of nuclear reactors, which would be burrowed in craters due to radiation shielding being too heavy to be brought with. But it was to be far enough away from the living quarters that it would not bring harm to the crew. Hopefully. Many vehicles would also be needed for this construction. Teisenhausen was in charge of the lunar vehicles, and he had quite the challenge awaiting him. First and foremost was that the gravity on the Moon is only 16.5% of what it is on Earth, and the vehicles had to be very much adapted for this new displacement. His design for the construction vehicle took this into account, coming in at a hefty weight of 9,000 Earth pounds fully loaded. This bad boy could travel at a top speed of 5 miles an hour, powered by a pair of 4 horsepower electric engines, and had an operational range of 50 to 150 miles. For comfort, a pressurized cabin was fitted, allowing for operation without the need for a spacesuit. And for utility, it had a bulldozer blade, crane, tow hooks, and robotic arms. To avoid the soldiers in suits having to walk around on the surface too much, a transport vehicle was needed. Consisting of a skeletonized frame made from lightweight metals, it was going to need to be compact, just 6 feet square, with the seat and controls exposed. Avoiding the need for a cab, although a 2-man cab could be used if required. A small load deck, like a pickup truck, would be at the back. Also electrically powered, this 3-axle vehicle would weigh just 2,000 pounds and be able to move a load of men and equipment between 50% and 300% of its own weight, depending on the nature of the surface. The total tractive power of the vehicle was 6 horsepower. Suitable batteries would provide a range of 50 miles or 10 hours of operation before needing to be recharged. Interestingly, the design prospects for this vehicle are missing from the available copies of Project Horizon. So, no pictures. Sorry. The United States Air Force Foreign Technology Division, doing its own lunar research, also happened upon the work of a Romanian Major General, D. St. Andreescu, a member of the Romanian Commission on Aeronautics. He had already been theorizing what lunar vehicles could be like since 1957, so his designs had notable influence on Project Horizon. A foreign analysis of other types of lunar vehicles was first published for the U.S. Air Force in 1967, from an original document by Andreescu published in 1963. His work involved looking at conflict and exploration in space, so it is no surprise that his work would garner attention from the U.S. Two of these would be of particular interest: a giant tracked ball and a tracked Lunamobile. He left no citations, however, as to his inspiration, so it is unknown how much of his ideas were truly original. The tank-like vehicle ran on wide tracks supported by 4 large road wheels and a drive or jockey wheel at either end. It is not clear which end the power was supplied to for the tracks, as it is not shown in the available image of the vehicle. No support rollers are shown either. The track is, however, covered across the top by a large dust shield to prevent clouds of regolith being thrown up as it moves. The body of the vehicle is flat-sided with a shallow, sloping front surface, which on a tank would be considered the glacis. The rear is more sharply angled. On top of the vehicle is shown to be what appears to be an exhaust stack for venting gas and/or heat, much like a ship's funnel over the back end, with a large dome with multiple rectangular windows at the front of the roof. Inside are shown to be a trio of astronauts. Completing the vehicle are a pair of headlamps at the front, a flapped horizontal slot and circular feature, perhaps a light, on the glacis. Projecting from the front, just below those headlamps, are a pair of supporting arms for what appear to be a bulldozer blade. It would be powered by electric motors running on compressed, pressurized hydrogen provided by a turbo generator and recharged by the use of nuclear power generators. This power supply would propel the vehicle on the lunar surface at up to 40 kilometers an hour for 24 hours of continuous use between recharges. The heat irradiated from the passengers on board would boil off the hydrogen fuel source, and this heat was then recaptured by a lithium hydride recuperator. This power supply would weigh just 1,200 kilograms, more than 200 kilograms less than an equivalent diesel engine, and without the problems of liquid fuels in a lunar environment. If the tracked Lunamobile is rather mundane as a tracked vehicle, albeit one designed for the moon, then it is the spherical vehicle idea from Andreescu that is perhaps the most curious. This was a vehicle with a spherical hull and held upright by means of a gyroscopic stabilization, ensuring that the 3 or 4 men inside would stay correctly orientated in relation to the lunar surface. Running on a single circumferential track, the spherical Lunamobile was thought to be useful for exploring the surface due to its shape, which would prevent it from becoming stuck in a crater. The second track ran circumferentially around the vehicle in the horizontal plane, meaning that if the vehicle ever toppled to one side,
I've fallen, and I can't get up!
It could move by being driven by both tracks either out of the obstruction or until the gyroscopes righted the vehicle. Power was supplied by a large circular solar cell acting as a parasol above the vehicle, which could be angled to receive maximum solar radiation, although no other details are provided. The curious matter about this vehicle, described in General Andreescu's report from 1963, is that this vehicle features at all. It is, in fact, identical to the spherical lunar vehicle seen in Volume 3 of the top-secret Project Horizons plan, a plan which was still secret through this time. Looking at the two views of this vehicle in these two reports, it is hard not to see that one party must have known about the other, and, as Horizon was 4 years before Andreescu's report, it would seem at first glance that Andreescu took inspiration from it for that image. The Project Horizon work was, again, for decades, top secret, so it was unlikely that he could have seen the tracked spherical Lunamobile, unless he was a master spy. No, he wasn't. Instead, the logical conclusion is that the spherical tracked vehicle predated the Project Horizon in some non-classified form, which ABMA and, in due course, Andreescu drew inspiration. Whether this was something serious or some science fiction mumbo-jumbo is not known at this point. Certainly, if ABM was copying from some pre-existing data from Andreescu, then the tracked and rather practical Lunamobile could reasonably have been expected to have featured in Project Horizon. The use of a spherical exploration vehicle in the Project Horizon plan comes up during the discussion of combat as well. So it is fair to say that where the concepts of combat on a lunar surface are concerned, they would, in the eyes of the planners, inevitably involve vehicles, and probably tracked ones at that. And of course, you know what that means. Space tanks. Considering the very formidable Soviet space program and the sense of a race to the moon, it was part of the planning activities of the program that there was potential for the base to be attacked by the Soviets. It would, after all, be a base for nuclear weapons. In considering combat on the lunar surface, the environmental considerations of temperature, pressure, or rather lack thereof, and the low gravity made for a complex combat situation. Sole possession of a lunar outpost would provide a military advantage in case of terrestrial hostilities. Defense must be provided to deter attack to obtain such an advantage. Development of various elements of equipment to meet the needs of the defenders was going to be divested to the various expert technical agencies. For example, nuclear weapon systems will be left in the hands of the Atomic Weapons Laboratories at Picatinny Arsenal. Electronic systems would be in the hands of the Diamond Ordnance Fuse Laboratory, or DOFL. And missile/rocket design would go to the U.S. Army Ordnance Missile Command, or AOMC. On the surface of the moon, vehicles were going to be needed to move around, build facilities, and provide security, and these were left in the hands of the Ordnance Tank Automotive Command in Detroit, with responsibility for developing and testing both combat and transport vehicles to meet special requirements. If the moon and other planets are explored and possibly colonized, the world could eventually see a second evolution of weaponry and protection therefrom. Visualized starting with a weapon capable of penetrating thin-skinned vehicles. The vehicles then get thicker skin. The weapons then attain greater penetrating capability. The vehicles get even thicker skin until the weight and cost thereof becomes insurmountable. The weapon attains longer ranges, etc., etc., etc. This proceeds through the mortar, howitzer, gun, and tank stages until you eventually have missiles, anti-missiles, and nuclear weapons. Just as the comment above related to tanks, it was part of Project Horizon's initial assessment that the use of vehicles in a potential attack or defense at the outpost was a credible concern. Although they could not carry armor in the conventional tank sense due to the difficulties in getting such a vehicle to the moon, it was certainly conceivable that such vehicles may have some ballistic protection beyond just retaining a pressurized atmosphere within the vehicle. Thus, any weapons planned for the outpost should also have anti-material ability to perforate a vehicle and depressurize it or cripple the automotive parts. Such a unique combat environment prevented the use of conventional ammunition and weapons like rifles. Since conventional firearms were designed to fire in Earth gravity situations, the sights would be almost useless. Add to this the reduced gravity on the moon would seriously affect the trajectory of any bullet fired, and the other features of a conventional rifle, like the stock, were not required because a man in a spacesuit would not be able to carry the weapon easily in such a way, and what is left is the need for a bespoke weapon, albeit one which might use conventional types of ammunition. However, that too involved a lot of weight wastage through a casing. Newton's third law of motion states that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. In other words, recoil, and this recoil will be much harder to manage for the soldier in a low gravity environment. With no effective atmosphere either, any missile fired would not be subject to drag or friction, like it would on Earth, and would increase the range of a projectile by 6 times or more. The same was also true of the explosive outgassing behind a recoilless weapon, making them extremely hazardous to friendly vehicles, buildings, or personnel behind. Basically, the backblast is much more back and much more blast. The same applied to explosively producing fragments or debris, as it would travel much farther and faster on Earth. Given that penetration is a function of the square of the velocity of the projectile, even bits of regolith kicked up by a blast created an enormous hazard for men and machines. The effect on target of the projectile, or directed energy device, differed substantially from terrestrial combat as well, as substantial damage could be done to a target by simply exposing it to the vacuum of space, piercing the suit or vehicle skin. An attack on the outpost from the Soviets could not come without warning. Either the launch would be detected, or the launch craft would be picked up by Earth-based monitoring. If a craft could be landed secretly, the outpost would still be equipped with short-range radar set with a range of up to 2 miles, and backed up by an infrared system with a range of about 500 yards. Planning assumption for outpost defense related to a roughly platoon-sized attacking force, but defense had to consider the following 4 combat situations. 1. Space-suited personnel combat. 2. Lunar surface vehicle combat. 3. Moon-orbiting space vehicles. And 4. Non-orbiting space vehicles. Project Horizon also had to consider the various modes of killing or incapacitating an enemy force. This perimeter defense had to be able to provide adequate means of killing both suited individuals and vehicles, and should be fireable directly or remotely. Options for such a weapon were considered and evaluated for both performance, but also whether or not they were technically feasible. Remember, all this is supposed to happen on the moon. These included, number 1, beamed electromagnetic radiation. 2, flamethrower. 3, blast weapons. 4, fragmentation weapons. And 5, radiant energy. Defending against orbiting craft was far more complex than a surface defense, and, while an orbiting enemy could be tracked using radar, it would be difficult to engage, as available surface-to-orbit missiles are well beyond the 1,000-pound weight limit, so a new weapon was needed. This would be expensive and with a long development time. An Electron Accelerator based weapon was considered, could work by directing beams of gamma and or neutron radiation at a craft to kill the crew and damage the craft. Just like the missile idea, however, this was far too heavy, weighing over 6,000 pounds on Earth. Even on moon gravity, still too heavy. In conclusion, Project Horizon rationalized that no effective defense could be provided against an enemy orbiting vehicle, and that the men on the outpost could, at best, dig into the surface to retain protection from orbital bombardment until a suitable missile defense system became light enough to install there. With a unique set of problems from the environment, equally unique weapons would be needed for troops to use if combat was to take place between the US soldiers and the Soviet invasion force. Spacesuits would have to include an element of armor protection, along with the ability to self-seal following penetration, as a simple weapon which made even a small hole in the suit could prove lethal. More holes meant a greater chance of killing the opponent with the environment, rather than the terrestrial method of killing the opponent by means of trauma. Weapons which optimized the delivery of high-velocity fragments were therefore considered the most desirable. The suit proposed by Project Horizon included a hard suit for the body, made from titanium approximately 4 mm thick for standard protection, and up to 10 mm thick for maximum protection covering the stomach and the chest, with a composite inner layer for resisting radiation. The same would also go for vehicles, with a titanium metal structure of approximately the same thickness, to provide resistance to fragments and to maintain pressurization. Later, in analyzing how much protection the titanium could actually provide on the lunar surface, it was calculated that a simple 6-grain fragment at 3,800 feet per second, or a 17-grain fragment at 2,400 feet per second, could pierce the suit or the vehicle. The assessment was clear that the best weapon for defeating an enemy force would be a Claymore-type mine. The standard Army type coming into service was the T-48E1, weighing just 1.36 kilograms and containing 675 5.56mm diameter steel balls in a plastic resin. Once detonated, these little balls, which were arranged in a slightly concave shape, would be fired out at a speed of almost 4,000 feet per second across a 60-degree arc. On Earth, the mine's effective radius was around 200 feet, but on the Moon, with no atmosphere to slow it down, the effective lethal range was increased to about half a mile, although the spread of the balls at that range would be extreme. The claymores could be set as a perimeter defense to be triggered upon command or by tripwire, but they could also be handheld. Now, this was not as dangerous as it may sound. Due to the vacuum of space, there was no blast hazard to the man detonating it, because it was on the end of a 5-foot pole, with a suitable shield surrounding the back of the mine as well to prevent fragments from going that way. In total, it was under 1 kilogram in weight, and this made it simple, cheap, and easy to use for all combat purposes against the enemy. While the attack scenarios involving an orbiting enemy were complex, the use of nuclear weapons was a possible counter. Detonating a 10 megaton nuclear device in space, launched from the outpost, would have a lethal radius of around 320 kilometers. In doing this, however, there was a tremendous risk of destroying themselves with their own weapons' radiation, since, unlike a detonation on Earth, a nuclear blast in the vacuum produces intense radiation rather than blast or thermal energy release, and due to the lack of atmosphere, the radiation would take a far longer distance to dissipate to safe levels. Proximity to the blast radius was also one of the notable flaws of the Army's new M28 Davy Crockett weapon system. Often referred to as a recoilless rifle, it was in fact a 120mm spigot mortar firing the Mark 54 nuclear warhead. With a yield of 20 tons of TNT, the warhead on Earth would cause severe damage over a 10-meter radius and moderate blast damage out to around 500 meters. On the Moon, however, with no atmosphere to attenuate the explosion, the damage and the range of the projectile would be much further. A Moon-based Davy Crockett, fired at the maximum angle of 45 degrees, could reach a lunar altitude of just over 1,200 meters, high enough to be a threat to descending enemy craft, but not high enough to engage an orbital target. At this altitude, the radiation emitted from the blast would still be a significant problem for the Moon-based personnel. An alternative to the M28 was also considered, one which was more accurate, lighter, and simpler, albeit with a dangerously shorter range. This was the Dumbo 2, which was still on the drawing board at this stage, but it consisted of little more than just a launching tray with legs, and a rocket-propelled bomb loaded onto it. On the lunar surface, this device would have a range of just 4 kilometers, with an accuracy of around 40 meters. It was, in the understatement of the decade, desirable to increase the range. With a range improvement of up to 16 kilometers, it would also make the system 30 pounds heavier, up to around 160 pounds. In 1965, This subject of lunar personnel weapons was examined once more by the U.S. Army in an unusually titled report known as The Meanderings of a Weapon-Oriented Mind when Applied in a Vacuum Such as the Moon. Friggin' weird title. With the sizable problems of cold welding over close-fitting and non-low-friction metal parts, no lubricants, extreme temperatures, and recoil from conventional type weapons, solutions to a projectile weapon were perhaps harder to overcome in some regards than for creating a vehicle. The laser, light amplification by stimulated emissions of radiation, a concept of creating a focused and intense beam of light, had been theorized for some time, but did not exist before May 1960, when Theodore Maiman made the first laser, a ruby laser, at the Hughes Research Laboratory in California. To theorize a laser weapon was beyond the ability of engineering in 1965. And it was not until 1967, with CO2 lasers of over 1,000 watts, that the first lasers were powerful enough to cut through a sheet of steel 1 millimeter thick at TWI, the Welding Institute of Cambridge in England. Although proposed in the report as a solution, laser-based systems were just a pie in the sky, leaving recoilless or very low recoil weapons as the next preferable alternative. Projectiles considered were rockets of various descriptions, balls, flechettes, and even rocks, which, based on a low-gravity environment, would travel 2.73 times further than they would on Earth. For example, a projectile going about 3,000 feet per second horizontal, 5 feet off the ground, would go 2,500 meters just about. However, if the same projectile were launched upward at 45-degree angle with the same velocity, it would travel around 320 miles, having reached an altitude of 80 miles straight up. Man, that's pretty high. The lack of drop on the rounds added the severe hazard of projectiles being in flight for very large distances and very long periods of time, but also had one significant advantage. The lack of anything other than the most rudimentary sights was required. This is because the projectile would drop some 60 millimeters for every 100 meters it travels horizontal. Given a maximum line of sight engagement range at about 1.5 kilometers, a projectile would, at worst, drop around 90 centimeters. The lack of atmosphere also meant that there was no wind resistance, so the shape of the projectile did not matter in terms of an efficient ballistic shape, though keeping a pointy aerodynamic shape was still preferable since it was better for penetrating. The report concluded with a series of prospective weapon types summarized below. Noteworthy is that none of them are as expensive or perhaps simple and dangerous to men in vehicles as the Claymore on a stick proposed in Project Horizon. There had yet to be any spacewalks or extravehicular activity in spacecraft by 1959, so the science on what exactly the clothing should be for such an operation were not yet fully understood. There were, however, clear goals for a practical suit, and the advantage of the low gravity meant that a 300-pound spacesuit would weigh just 50 pounds on the lunar surface. Nonetheless, wearing a spacesuit is a tiring task, and normal wear would be limited to just 8 to 12 continuous hours, though with a degree of caution, someone could operate in the suit for up to 24 hours, and, in a dire emergency only, 72 hours was possible. Referred to as a metallic body conformation suit, the outer surface was to be shiny, like all good 1950s sci-fi, in order to reflect the heat, but tough enough to resist the impact of micrometeorites. Any combat taking place in such a suit would be awkward and obvious to any attacker. Termination. In 1959, there was a serious lack of crucial data on which to make the necessary decisions, such as, where even to put the base. Earth-based observations of the moon could show the seas, large flattish areas with few impacts, but the best available map being made by the Army Map Service was 1 in 5 million scale, and the contours were 2,000 feet apart, meaning that what looked like a flat surface could actually be a very steep slope, and landing on a cliff was definitely ill-advised. An improved version of the map, due around 1960, using better methods of stereo imaging analysis, was only 1 in 1 million scale, with contours just 300 meters apart. With the aim of getting accuracy on surface features down to 150 or maybe even the preposterous 100 meters by 1962, it is obvious, therefore, that with such little knowledge of what the moon actually looked like on the surface, any outpost might find itself on impossible terrain. Any such landing without a better idea of what was there was impossible in practical terms. This was a fundamental part of the death knell for such ideas. It had not been the cost which killed Project Horizons, but perhaps as much as politics and practicality. It was not seen as being unfeasible or even unaffordable, but perhaps just not necessary. The idea of launching at least one new Saturn rocket every week for years on end was something that the Army could live with. But with the formation of NASA in October 1958, they would quickly take over all of the space work from the Army. And NASA had no interest in this project of lunar warfare, and thus it was left to die. No weapons base on the moon meant no need for weapons against men and machines, no lunar combat, and no moon tanks. In 1967, with the signing of the Outer Space Treaty, all signatories, including the US and the USSR, agreed not to place nuclear weapons in space, either in orbit or on a celestial body, and that the moon in particular was to be used exclusively for peaceful scientific purposes. It also prohibits the establishment of military bases, installations, and fortifications on the moon, although military facilities for peaceful purposes were not prohibited. The treaty did not end ideas for a moon base, such as ideas like Project Ares in the 1990s, but it did preclude space-based nuclear weapons. A further treaty, known as the Agreement Governing the Activities of States on the Moon and Other Celestial Bodies, more concisely known as the Moon Treaty, was signed in 1979 and added to the Outer Space Treaty that prohibited the creation of military bases, although neither the US nor the USSR have ratified that one. Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty is as follows. State parties to the treaty undertake not to place in orbit around the Earth any objects carrying nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction, install such weapons on celestial bodies, or station such weapons in outer space in any other manner. The moon and other celestial bodies shall be used by all state parties to the treaty exclusively for peaceful purposes. The establishment of military bases, installations, fortifications, the testing of any type of weapons, and the conduct of military maneuvers on celestial bodies shall be forbidden. The use of military personnel for scientific research or for any other peaceful purposes shall not be prohibited. The use of any equipment or facility necessary for peaceful exploration of the moon and other celestial bodies shall also not be prohibited. No national sovereignty rules in outer space. Those who venture there go as envoys of the entire human race. Their quest, therefore, must be for all mankind, and what they find should belong to all mankind. Project Horizon was, perhaps, more of an embarrassment just a few years after it had been completed. The new NASA-controlled program was not interested in nuclear weapons on the moon, and the Defense Department fought to prevent its release to the public. In a 3-year struggle from 1959 to 1962, the project was subject to numerous requests for release, and, after no less than 10 separate security reviews by 3 different intelligence agencies, it was finally revealed at the end of the year. the project was effectively obsolete before it had even finished, regardless of any future changes. But it can be said that the project did form an important preparatory step in the long process of getting men to the moon. And, for our boy Eisenhower, it was the first steps towards a lunar rover, which would eventually make its debut with the Apollo 15 mission in July 1971. Well, that's it for this video. If you liked it, please hit the like button and the bell button and all the other buttons. There's a lot of buttons these days, I'll tell you what. But yeah, we got social medias. We got like all the social medias. They're in the description and stuff. And the article's in the description too, which has been heavily modified for a YouTube audience. So if you want to see what it's like in the original form, please see the article in the description. And yeah, big thanks to Andrew Hills for, writing the article, because the video wouldn't get very far without one. And yeah, this was edited and voiced and stuff by your boy Jim Zawacki. And keep us in your sights. Alright, good night.